This evening I'm talking with Mark Thomas, Deputy Chair of the Orakei Local Board, among other hats he wears. Mark, good evening.
Hi, how are you, Ken?
I'm well. Mark, what other hats do you wear? Because I see by your resume that you're into a number of projects.
Yeah, look, well, council sort of keeps us all busy, of course, but I've got a consulting business too. So I guess we work with private sector clients typically, actually on a lot of public sector issues. So we try and work with our clients to better engage with their customers or better engage with their stakeholders. So it's much like the work we do at council. Right.
So you don't do a lot of that on a national level, at a national perspective?
Yeah, the clients that we have often have a national sort of remit, like in healthcare space, sort of in the community care space. So yeah, we're working both in Auckland but also. Yeah,
so a lot of that work actually informs the work that you do at the local level.
Yeah, look, I think, well, I'd like to say there's like an intersection between the two work. That obviously we're very, very local with the local board stuff. The client work is broader, national and sometimes international, but I think there's quite a relationship.
So, just looking at Orakei, is that home?
Yes, indeed, yeah. So I live on the western part of Orakei in Remuera, so that's really just the border suburb between Wairarapa and the Orakei ward.
And that's been home for some time?
Yeah, about 12 years. Our eldest son is 12 years of age, and that's when we moved there.
So you would have found a lot of changes happening in your hood over those 12 years?
Yeah, look, there have been. We've moved around a few times, as Aucklanders often do. And for sure, you see changes with the people who live there. So a changing demographics, people coming from different countries, which is great to live in Auckland. Change in housing, of course.
Yes.
Yeah.
A lot more intensification locally in the little villages. I lived in Koei,
right,
and the intensification process in the late 90s, early 2000s there quite changed it. I guess you find that all over Orakei?
Well, look, there's been a lot of infill, as you'd know, traditionally, kind of in parts of the eastern suburbs. And I suppose that sort of subdivision approach has continued. I guess the big changes that we've seen in our ward have been in areas like Stonefields. Until recently, until recently that was Auckland's new suburb. I think Hobsonville Point and others, Flatbush have taken over, but 6,500 people will live in Stonefields when it's finished. So for those who think that Orakei is not taking its fair share of intensification, I think 6,500 is not bad.
So in that time, as you've watched it grow and change, obviously you've been motivated to become quite involved in the new super city and engage in that process. What are the key learnings that have come out of that 12 years?
Look, I think the key learning is we've still got much more that we need to do to take people on this journey. I think in Orakei that's what we try and do. We typically work hard to get engagement.
Yeah, you're highly energetic as a board. I see you around the traps. What would be the essence of the messages that you're trying to put across to the agencies and to council as we now go into this fifth year of our long-term plan process?
Well, I think you're right. Having been here since this thing started 5 years ago, I think that there are really three key themes that have come through. Are we creating an affordable city? Are we creating a city that's actually going to fix transport? And are we creating a city where growth is going to be delivered in a way that people want? And that's right for Auckland.
Yeah, so I suppose those are the three key themes of the Auckland plan, really, aren't they?
I think that they were part of the Auckland plan, but of course the Auckland plan is 500 pages, it's 13 chapters, and I wonder if we've lost our way a bit in terms of all that stuff, because I think Aucklanders' needs are quite focused on affordability, transport and growth. There'll be other things, of course, but I think those are three I think are key. Whereas, of course, the Auckland plan contemplates much more. And I just wonder if we need to have a bit of a reset in terms of that Auckland plan.
Yeah, so in terms of the Auckland plan as she was writ at the outset, a lot of the settled work that appeared in the Auckland Plan came out of the west and the south, and there was more discussion amongst the east and the north as to the content. I think a lot of people, there's a common denominator of transport, obviously, but some of the key areas that the Orakei and the like weren't comfortable from the outset with. Has that changed? Well,
the question I think for people to ask is this really a plan for all of Auckland? Because I can tell you in the case of the Orakei ward, we hardly feature in the Auckland Plan. I think what we've got is a view of development for Auckland in some areas. So it's not really an Auckland plan, it's a view of how Auckland might develop. Orakei doesn't feature strongly. There are other parts of Auckland that don't feature strongly. So it is a plan, but I don't think it's fair to call it an Auckland plan.
So how the Auckland plan then informs the draft unitary plan? Is there any more, do you feel any more at ease with the unitary plan as it's been fed in to the unitary plan hearings panel?
Look, I guess the short answer is no, and my unease is informed by, there's the thousands and thousands of people who feed back to us every year during the consultation, right? So we're lucky we get a lot of feedback in Orakei, and so I think we're quite informed. But I use this current LTP to travel around Auckland. I went to 12 of the Have Your Say meetings, and the south, the west, and the north, and I was surprised how similar the kind of perspectives are.
So what was the vibe?
People don't want rates to increase very much, mainly because they're not quite sure what they get for it. There's a whole value for money thing. They want local things generally fixed more than regional, so local transport issues in Lake Road and in Devonport and the electrification of Orakei. These are more important often for local people than the grand region.
Yeah, there's everybody that I talk to is in that same zone where obviously the areas, their area, their patch is where they want the dosh to be spent. If there's only a certain amount to go around, and bearing in mind that compared to other regions, compared to other big cities, our rates are quite low, or our land taxes are quite low. We're going to have to reprioritise if we're going to actually keep the rates down and satisfy some of these very local issues. So how do you feel that you can add value in terms of justifying that?
Well, I think there's two things to do, and you've actually summed it up. One thing is add value. So I think we need to sort of talk to people in a more honest way about what council does and what it doesn't do. So there's this big perception, scepticism really, of the value council adds. That's why people don't want rates increases overwhelmingly. They're nervous or sceptical or uncertain about what council does. So actually the next mayor for Auckland needs to add more value to the whole council idea. But the second thing in doing so is actually to focus it down to more of the stuff that matters more, like fixing transport, like having growth that delivers what we need, but also is supported by our communities.
So I guess you've touched on the mayoralty. You think there needs to be a refresh by the sound of it?
Look, so I've spent the last 5 or 6 months talking to people all around Auckland at Have Your Say, but also to many of my councillor and local board colleagues about what they think the issues are. Firstly, you avoid the politics and you just think, what are the issues? And these themes of affordability, transport and growth came up a lot. I think 4.5 years on, now we've had this budget set for the LTP. I think we can answer the question about whether we think the mayor has led us to a position that positions us well. And for me, the answer is no. And I think we now need a new mayor for Auckland.
So, whoever he or she may be, what would be your first message?
Well, I think a better leader for Auckland, a new mayor, needs to reset the Auckland Plan. The next mayor will lead the 6-yearly rewrite of the Auckland Plan. And look, only 23,000 people were involved in the first Auckland Plan. There's over 1 million people in Auckland over the age of 18.
Well, it's interesting because some of the early consultation processes were these workshops rather than the old-fashioned style judicial review.
Sure.
Do you feel that worked, and would you advocate for those workshops again?
Look, I come from a tradition where you kind of deeply engaged with communities. My first political experience was out of Auckland, but we were kind of like, looking at pieces of paper on the floor and kind of building the city we want. And look, not all communities are going to want that, but some do want to engage. And you either engage or you don't. And we've now created a situation where, despite the fact we had 28,000 reply to the LTP, if they look at the responses, the results, I mean, they'll just be wondering what the point was. So the next leader for Auckland needs to really reconfigure this engagement thing.
So just thinking about it a bit more broadly, perhaps in 12 months' time, 18 months' time, we'll have a unitary plan which will pop out the other end of this hearings process, which is a central government machine. A new mayor will be installed and will run a new process. Will that then have to feed in and alter the unitary plan? Is that your view of it?
Well, I think you're right to say the unitary plan is on a prescribed sort of legislative course where there'll be something that will come to the end. And that will inevitably inform the Auckland plan, the rewrite that happens. The next Mayor of Auckland will say, we need to keep moving forward, we don't want to go back. And you do that by taking the information you've got, including where the unitary plan's at, and using that to reset the priorities.
So then that would then fold into a new updated version of the unitary plan in 2018-19.
That's right. And we need to see where we've ended up, of course, with the unitary plan, because that requires, as you know, firstly Auckland Council consideration, approval or rejection of the hearings panel decisions, and then it goes to government. So that process still has to unfold.
So now, if we look at your three particular issues, the affordability issue, what is affordability? Is this affordability in terms of the rates? Is this affordability in terms of homes? What's the metrics that you use around that?
I think before you get to what the rate is, you get to what's being spent. And, we've got a budget of $3.5 billion a year. That'll increase, in fact, over the 10 years of this plan to around $4.5 billion. What we need to sort of do is think, what do Aucklanders want that spent on first? And then prioritise it. And we haven't done that as part of this plan.
Yeah, well, if you include Auckland Transport in the mix, then it's probably more like 14 or 15 billion.
Look, 18 billion is the total number. And Auckland Transport, to their credit, actually did a prioritisation exercise. And so that was useful because in the case of Orakei, that told us they've got $11 million worth of projects planned for us. We looked at those 4 projects. None of those 4 projects were our top priority. We said, actually, thank you very much. You can have that money back. We need just half of it to progress the top 2 priorities for us, which are Tamaki Drive and looking at a new Selwyn railway station. So that's a great example of the opportunity, like a real example in our area.
So essentially what you're saying is a gap analysis probably wasn't done in order to get this ranking, or what fell through the cracks?
I think there's kind of, frankly, a crack test, reality check that wasn't done. We've got, earnest, well-meaning people at Auckland Transport who've done all the models and come up with all the prioritisation. That was presented to us, we gave feedback, and what ended up surprised many of us, because it didn't align with the priorities our communities have been telling us for now almost 5 years.
So it seems to me that the cycleway, walkway issue, it's a major public safety issue, and it's not that expensive to fix in a big scheme of things.
It's not, and so the Mayor signed with us on the Orakei local board the first sub-regional master plan for the New Auckland in 2012, the Tamaki Drive master plan. So that contemplated as its top priority a shared cycleway to protect people, both drivers and cyclists and pedestrians. No significant progress has been made because of his lack of support for this.
Right, so it's a lack of support at the political level which is causing the bind.
It is, and to get support at the political level, you've got to have someone who kind of has a vision for the priorities that Aucklanders have. And what I think we're seeing now with the budget is a concentration at the top, at the regional level, and really just this big gap now, this growing gap between local communities.
Well, I suppose if we look at you can't look at it in isolation, can you? You can't look at this affordability and the want for a better transport in isolation. they're joined at the hip.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's some really big roading projects that have to be executed in your ward in order to actually radically improve the arterial road links. I mean,
Sure.
Banksy died over the southeastern link. Getting that through is a lot of political heft and a lot of money. Where is that sitting on your priority?
Well, I think the issue is how do we achieve these big projects? And we know we can't all ask the ratepayers to pay for them. I think in the case of transport, I think we do need to spend more. But you've got $8 billion in the Auckland transport budget. So before I asked Aucklanders to spend more, I'd want to have a much closer look. And my example of our little $11 million in Orakei shows you that there's some insight there. So you've got to have that kind of opening of the books, as it were. You've got to reprioritise and involve local boards. And then you've got to engage more positively with the private sector. I've got private sector clients who are telling me that it's too hard to invest in Auckland. They'd like to contribute more, but our planning rules or the way we interpret them make it too difficult. So that's another opportunity for the next mayor for Auckland.
And the unitary plan, will that streamline some of those planning rules, do you think?
Well, there's an opportunity there, certainly. I mean, getting rid of 7 previous district plans is certainly will help. But it then goes to the interpretation. I'm on a task force the government set up to try to look at rules. And I'm just hearing in Auckland story after story of well-meaning people who are feeling boxed in by the rules and actually not making decisions that actually help move Auckland forward. And we need to change that.
So if I look at some of the issues that popped up during the gestation of the unitary plan in Orakei, intensification, there was a drive to reduce the height of some of the building zones, perhaps de-intensify more parking spaces. So whereabouts along the trajectory of that planning process did Orakei fall away?
Sure. Well, of course, the Mayor's plan in the draft of the unitary plan was a broad brush intensification approach, this kind of everyone sort of shares the pain sort of approach. And so from a democratic point of view, it's fair that we do that. So the Mayor's approach initially was that we all share the pain. From a democratic point of view, that's reasonable. But actually, with growth planning, you need to be much more focused. And the haste to implement this unitary plan has meant we haven't been able to spend the time.
This is where really area planning and the fine mesh planning needs to have taken place to inform unitary plan. And perhaps that's something that you would see as being a precursor to rewriting the unitary plan once the new Auckland plans are.
I think the important thing to do is to talk about continuing to move forward. So you're right, the original model was to have area plans kind of helping inform the unitary plan, and then we had the unitary plan come over the top. We've got to find a way to keep moving forward, but actually have that granular detail, right, from local communities better inform what we end up with.
All these things cost money. The rate has been struck in a certain way. We've got a low UAGC, we've got essentially a flat rate plus a number of add-on bits, including now a transport levy. What's your readout?
So 9.9% is the average residential increase. This was the mayor who promised that rates would increase only by the rate of inflation. I'm not sure which rate of inflation he was talking about, but it's not a rate of inflation those of us who are paying for groceries know about. It's not 2.5%, it's not 3.5%, the number's 9.9%, and that's an average. Now, of course, some will be below that, but actually being an average, half will be above it.
In your world, would you change the UAGC?
Look, I think we need to review rating policy as part of the affordability issue that I mentioned before, because I don't think the rating policy is a fair one. One of the things it's not fair on is the cap. So the mayor decided that the rates transition was done, despite the fact that I think around 140,000 Aucklanders are still paying more than 10% rates increases. So it was within our control to try and retain that cap. We had an option, and he said, we're done. Now, that's not true, and that's not fair.
It wasn't really that government legislation terminated the cap.
So the existing cap mechanism we're using, you're right, was a function of the first 3 years of the government legislation. So we couldn't have done that without going back to government. But there was a third option, which allowed us to work within our existing rate system and find a way to retain that. Now, for sure, that would mean some people who were entitled to decreases would have to pay a bit more. But I think in the same way that those who are paying higher rates understand we're part of Auckland, we don't ring fence the rates. We need to invest in other communities. I think we all understand that. I think a fairer rating policy would actually minimise the decreases so that the increases were minimised. But look, that's a good conversation to take to Aucklanders. Actually, as part of the LTP, Aucklanders weren't even asked about that.
Well, they certainly weren't asked about the transport levy.
They weren't asked about the transport levy. There was one sentence in the document that went to all houses, and there were no numbers mentioned. And so to come out with that, and I come from a position of believing we need to spend more. I come from a position of believing we need to spend more in transport. But the first thing I want to do is have a more honest scrutiny of the $8 billion budget. And then I want to say to Aucklanders, if I'm going to ask you to pay an extra $100 to $114 a year, this is what it's going to go on. Because there are two issues: how much, and what is it being spent on?
So the how much, I mean, that's really going to come down to, once again, central government's going to have to change the rules, because the capital value system is just skewing things as this soaring house price inflation eats into what we're going to be saving.
Yeah, look, I'm a big believer in working with what you've got. I think that too many local government politicians aspire for a world that may exist in the future. And look, I'm all about the aspiration, but while you're going for the aspiration, sort of play on the field where the game's being played. We've got the current rating system, so let's work within that, and let's meet our responsibilities to ratepayers to deliver something that's fairer, and actually then let's talk to them about that. Let's engage with them about that.
So, transport and infrastructure, I mean, whereabouts does Orakei sit in all that? Because you've got some pretty gnarly issues. There's some pretty old infrastructure in there. There's, as we talked about, there's some tough issues around transport.
That's right.
What's the view in your patch about those things in terms of, say, the age of the pipes or those nuts and bolts things that councils actually tend to gloss over, but they have to spend a lot of money fixing? I mean, you were involved with the work around the waterfront. That's a huge piece of work in terms of trying to bring infrastructure back up to scratch. Is there an acceptance that work needs to be done generally at the house by house level, the household level?
Look, locally there's absolutely that acceptance, and of course many people in my neck of the woods have been there for a while, and or as you indicated, have spent some time there. So you've got a sense of, I guess, the amenity that you get from some of that old infrastructure. So the problem is we don't fit within the Mayor's view of growth. So we're not a growth area for Auckland, despite the fact actually we grew almost 6% sort of census on census. So we are growing, but we don't fit his view of growth. So we get very limited access to development contributions and the way the Mayor funds growth. So our ageing infrastructure, and when you think of areas like Tamaki Drive, or our sports field, Medill's Farm, or the huge investment that's happening at Colin Park, these areas, Auckland comes to play in. And look, it's fabulous that they do. They're really part of the regional assets, but because of the Mayor's view of growth, we're not getting our fair share of investment to maintain and upgrade them. And that needs to change. That's not fair.
So, where to from here? We've got a council which kind of sits there and really, it's a bit like the mushroom principle, you know, they do a lot of sitting and talking, but they don't get very much except compost from the Mayor. It's a presidential style system. If there is a new Mayor coming in, would you be advocating for change at that council mayoral interface?
Look, I think that kind of change is essential. I don't think the role of councillors is actually valued enough in the way the Mayor organises things. I think that they are key sort of regional advocates. I think that their role should be more actively part of what we do, rather than just being there to listen to the Mayor's edicts. And I think he's got that wrong. I think that he sees it's his agenda and he just really needs councillors there to support him. Whereas, you know, he's actually making poorer quality decisions by not empowering councillors to sort of more effectively represent their areas, because I know they want to.
Yeah, well, certainly he's just increasingly isolating himself, as far as I can see, which isn't helping the city.
And there's a growing tension really between local boards and councillors too, because of the way the mayors run the councillor model. I think they're feeling stretched by the demands that they have to constantly be in meetings, to be reading hundreds and hundreds of pages a week. Whereas we're of course very involved locally, and indeed in many respects are much more closely involved than our time poor councillors. So I think the next mayor for Auckland needs to reset that. I think they need to empower local boards more. I think sort the funding out of local boards, but actually empower councillors more too, to make that role, I think, what was conceived by the Royal Commission, to be, you know, genuinely regional in their view, but informed by what's happening locally.
So I mean, you bring up the Royal Commission. I mean, to me, that document is worthwhile revisiting. Would you tip the Royal Commission's report back into the bowl that you're mixing up a new Auckland plan with?
Look, I think you use the information you've got, and inevitably you have to interpret it for the time you're in now. I think that set a framework of how Auckland Council should placemake. And actually I think that sometimes it got a bit of bad spin in terms of what people thought it was creating for Auckland. As I read it, and I reread it recently, I think it says Auckland local boards and the regional council have these specific roles and this is what they do. So maybe as part of an induction for the third Auckland Council come the next election, there should be a bit of a recap about what we were set up to do, and then you use that to kind of, you know, power us up for delivering, I think, this more targeted, more narrow, more focused, more effective placemaking role that was originally conceived.
And you know, powering up, how would we power up the local boards a bit more? Because we've really seen the mothership holding the reins very tight. And anybody who deals with the local boards very quickly comes to the conclusion that they're totally under-resourced. What would be a fairer distribution? How would you do it? Is it just dollars, or is it what is it?
Look, I know the argument gets reduced to dollars with local boards, and that's understandable. Local boards have discretion of only around $30 million out of a $3.5 billion budget. But actually it's more about the role they have and not about the money. So it's understanding that if we're to have this remarkable shared governance model, then we should have local boards governing the placemaking locally. And so that's really being less regionalised, because what we've seen, you know, coming up to the 5th year of Auckland Council is this growing regionalisation as more and more decisions and control is made centrally.
And we've seen that over many, many issues. Alcohol policy, there's any number of issues which were resolved very locally and quite target specific to the areas. And now, you know, it's all taken. Those decisions are taken away.
I was on the alcohol policy working party of the last council, so that was the constructing the kind of framework for the local alcohol policy. And you know, I can remember back then thinking, if we're not careful, really this won't be a local alcohol policy. It might be that in name, but actually effectively it'll be regional. And I think that's what we've ended up with, right? This broad brush approach that pays some minor heed to local, but is not genuinely a local alcohol policy.
No, especially where the panels sit, and really essentially they're a roving panel issuing licences, and it's really got to be a common template that they're working to, the way they've set it up. Whereas the old model, it could have been the local boards that issued the licences.
Well, I think you want to have the right role between what local boards do and what the organisation does. We want to get the efficiencies of scale, I think that's reasonable, but you want to have that informed by local decision making. And so this idea that a local board member can't form part of a DLC, you know, as if we don't know how to manage our responsibilities to be a regulator and our responsibilities to be an elected member, is laughable. So I think that's another example of, you know, the things that the next mayor needs to turn around to make Auckland really stronger, more consistent with what was intended.
So, do we need a new council chamber?
We don't need a new council chamber, and I say that only because I've spent quite a bit of time there, and it's about the priorities in terms of where Aucklanders would want money to be spent, in terms of where the case has been made. I mean, seriously.
So, Mark, what are your plans? What's Mark Thomas's next move in local government?
Well, I've started this really campaign for a new leader for Auckland, and what I want to do is actually go out and talk to communities to confirm that they also think affordability, transport is a summary of what the key issues are, to test that, to have that challenged. And then I want to find someone to be the next mayor for Auckland, because we don't have that person in our sights yet, and we need to.
So, I suppose just finally then, the one thing that I toy with is this issue of local and regional perspective, and it's probably a fairly new idea for regional Auckland when we had 128 little local boards, and then we had 8 cities and or 7 cities in the regional council. And perhaps that issue of perspective is one that local boards have got the most opportunity to, I suppose, to project. Have you a view on how perspective could be better delivered to the representatives and down to the locals?
It's interesting. I was at the Ellerslie Residents Association meeting last night, one of our 6 residents associations, and one of the guys there was talking to me about the old borough council days and how if they wanted anything done or if they needed anything known, they would go to the little borough town centre manager. And I hear that a lot, people who are obviously around in that time, and it sort of predates me a little bit, but they talk about just the value, not the bureaucracy, right, but the value of having an informed, strong local voice that had a specific mandate, didn't roam too wide. And I think we need to, if you don't inform kind of what's happened before, you're doomed to kind of fail in the future. I think we need to think about that model, look at what the opportunity is the super city gives us, and just reset to better deliver a super city that has the strong local boards and the strong communities that was planned with the great regional governance, because we've got a way to go.
Mark Thomas, thank you very much.
Thanks, Ken. Cheers.
Good man.